Well, why don't we just get started then? I think people will kind of roll in as we are talking. So let me at least introduce you. So thank you everybody for attending today's event. My name is Jacob Martinez. Yeah, we got some really cool people here today. So my name is Jacob Martinez. I'm the co-chair of the ACBS DEI SIG, along with Jennifer Payne. And I'm here to speak with Dr. Matthieu Villatte, professor at Bastille University. Is that in Seattle, Villatte?
Yeah, technically it's in Kenmore, but
in Kenmore.
Knows Kenmore, and Seattle sounds more cool, so
yeah,
it's in Seattle.
and so what we're doing here today, that the focus of our conversation today will be to follow up on a line of dialogue that was presented in a panel at this year's, or the most recent ACBS Worldcon, which was just a few months ago. And in that line of dialogue, Matthieu, you presented something very interesting, this idea that to be successful in some sense, or to be kind of noticed, or to fit into the mainstream when it comes to ACBS or academic publishing, not only do we have to write and publish in English, but also there is a sense of having to think like an American, is what you had said. And I really just wanted to extend that conversation because that really stuck out to me. And we didn't have enough time to really unpack that. So what I would like to do today is, for the audience watching this, we can really just make this a conversation or a dialogue, especially if there aren't too many people live in the chat watching this. So as you have questions for Matthieu, you can please put them into the chat, and I'll either read them myself, or if you want to come on and ask a question with video and audio, feel free to do that as well. So I'll be monitoring the chat as we go through today.
That's good.
All right. Well, why don't we dig in? First, perhaps we can start with just picking up with that little nugget of conversation, the idea that we have to think like Americans, and also perhaps that kind of changes even how we conceptualize ourselves in a certain way. Can you just go ahead a little bit more and just extend that point that you made?
Yeah, first I want to make a quick full disclosure, which in a way starts my answer also in terms of content. I really speak from a personal perspective. It's not false modesty when I speak as an expert. I'm not afraid of saying I'm an expert. In this case, I don't feel like I'm an expert. I have an experience, and I've gathered information and build a perspective. I guess that's true of an expert too. But in this case, I really feel like I could be, completely wrong and biased. But it's I've talked with other people who've published in English or tried to get or even successfully developed a career in a CBS or in a more mainstream scientific community. And I feel like we share that common perspective that the challenge is not only to be literally understood and to understand, so to learn to read English, to be able to access the literature, which is mainly in English, or to write your papers in English so that they can be published. But it really goes beyond that, and that can become both more challenging in terms of acquiring skills, but also challenging in terms of risk of compromission. Like how far can you go to be published, or to be noticed, or to be part of the community? What are you going to lose there? And it's difficult to really hard to find an answer to that. Like in everything in life, I guess when you change, should you change? Should you stay yourself? Are you learning, or are you forgetting something important? Like, for example, when I published or wrote my first manuscript in English, at first the challenge was to write a correct English. So I had feedback from some people were friends and not experts in psychology, so they could arrange English so that it would be really correct. But then as first papers got rejected or had feedback from more experts in the field, I started to realize that there were things that really went beyond the correct English. It was more a matter of style. And in terms of ego, for me, it was a little harder to take because I consider myself a very good writer in French, even back then. And so that's where you start to feel like, well, is it really a matter of style or English or person reading it? And I think over time, as a sort of multiple exemplar training, I started to realize, and it was confirmed, even if it's not hard data, by native English speakers, especially Americans, that there is a way of thinking in at least in psychological science, I don't know, beyond. For example, I would often hear the feedback that need to be more direct, that sentences that were more circumvoluted, as we would do in French or Italian, I think Spanish too, where it is possible that the hypothesis could be that, it's like the sort of multiple clauses to be, and I think Americans would see that as excessively cautious. I remember the things that I would hear was that, well, we know that it's you speaking, so you don't have to say, I think that's, or it's possible that we assume that that's the case. And I thought that was interesting. I have to say that I liked learning that. There is something appealing about this, because that's probably why the Americans have been so successful in science and in technology and all, is that it's pragmatic, it's direct, it's ability to change. And so that was appealing. But at the same time, progressively, I felt like I think especially as I started living in the US and working in the US, and over time, starting to also see the limitations of that. Like this, we know that it's you speaking and you don't have to add, I think that. I started to feel like, well, you can say that, but do you actually respond from that perspective, And it's interesting that since I've moved to the US, the American society seemed to have increased in terms of division, polarization, and that I think that maybe seems to be quite missing actually in the dialogue these days, like that owning your perspective and owning that it's only a perspective, and that when you're listening to somebody else, it doesn't necessarily have the same value. An expert is not the same as a novice, of course, but it doesn't hurt to add reminders in the way we express ourselves. And I think perhaps Americans are all too confident, or they were, maybe it's changing, that because it's assumed, then we remember it and people understand that. So I guess that's an example, but that's one that stood out for me. And over time, I started to feel like I did not want to express myself necessarily from that perspective, even if I was the common style, the standard style. The other thing I want to say quickly, perhaps we can elaborate on that, is that what I've discovered over time, and by discover I mean that my perspective, again, not like that was the actual fact, but is that in American scientists, publishers' mind, I think it's very hard for them to distinguish the American culture from the canons of what is good science. And that makes sense because they've been dominating it for so long that for them, it's hard to see the difference. It's hard to know that it is possible to do differently. And when you try to get in that community or to meet these standards, you can also suffer from the same bias. Is to think, oh, I'm not good enough, but not realize that it's that you're not American enough. And that's two different things, I think. I think it's particularly important to take that into account when considering how much we're trying to bring more diversity pretty much everywhere. But even in that process, it's, I think, still dominated by the American way of thinking about diversity. Like I see my friends, colleagues in Europe, in academia, it seems like they're incredibly influenced by the way Americans think about diversity. I think it's, I mean, certainly a problem for someone like me who's not Native American and feel like there's something missing. But I think all things considered, there's probably always something missing when we have only one perspective. And maybe it's even worse when that while trying to bring more diversity, we are still thinking from maybe not one perspective, but a certain dominant perspective.
Yeah, definitely. And so I really like how you're saying that early on in your career, some of these, just the ways you're phrasing, the clauses that you're using, you're getting feedback that's saying like, it doesn't seem like you're speaking directly enough. And what I think too, if I can interpret that from my American brain, right? I think even just phrasing things in such as I think that, or I believe, or it's possible that this, I think what we're afraid of here is that kind of language almost signifies like a weakness, like a weakness in our position. We're not sure enough about what we're, we're saying.
Maybe deception too. It's possible.
Correct.
Like you're not saying really what you think, and it's perhaps there is less tolerance to uncertainty, and you could link it maybe to culture and histories and make up stories that I honestly I don't know. I think I think French was used to be the language of diplomacy. I think I'm not even sure exactly why. I guess it was tradition or something like that. But these things get in your culture, you don't even know where it's from, but it becomes something very important. It's like, do you hold the door to people? Do you say hello? Do you smile? Yeah, and if tomorrow you learn because you move to another culture that you don't do that, of course it makes sense to learn the standards because it's adapted. But like I said, if you're trying to contribute to a community that's it's international and try to think of science as a combination of perspectives, then maybe that defeats the purpose to lose your particular perspective, which may be strange, different for the American culture. But the point is that you're bringing something different. And it's a challenge. I don't think it's like, my point is not to blame Americans when you dominate. Usually it's because you've been successful, so that's fair enough. And then you don't see your blind spots. I think we are all responsible for it too. Like the way I've embraced American standards and even starting to be proud of meeting those standards, especially living in the US, and then advising other people from other countries and saying, no, it's not the way you should do it. It's a whole thing. Yeah.
Tom, you had a question. Go ahead and jump in. You're on mute, Tom.
You're muted, yeah.
Sorry about that. I have a combination of a question and comment, really. And first of all, Matt, it's wonderful to see you. Hey. I'm curious about your perspective of the idiosyncratic nature of the issue in JCBS. I mean, there's one aspect of it, which is that the JCBS and other American-based journals operate on the American Psychological Association's handbook for publication standards. And over the years, it's gotten increasingly stronger in saying that good writing uses an active voice, not a passive voice. I'm 60, and when I was younger, all the academic training that I got taught me to use a passive voice.
Interesting.
And it was in the last 10 years that I've watched the APA move from the 4th to the 5th to the 6th to the 7th, and increasingly stronger statements that good writing involves an active voice. That's one thing. But then the other piece, which I think I'm just really curious if you're all like noticing this, is that JCBS is very idiosyncratic in that it comes out of behavior analysis. Behavior analysis is the black sheep of psychology, and emerged kind of like a marginalized group that had to fight for its own say so in the world. And it comes out of, the tradition of American pragmatism, John Dewey, William James, and also the emerging science of physiology, Jacques Loeb, Max Ernst. I mean, these voices were also within biology marginalized.
Yeah.
For that matter, David Sloan Wilson, coming straight out of that same tradition, marginalized by the evolutionary science community for 40 years until E.O. Wilson finally said, David was right, I was wrong. I mean, that's, I think, like, I read Bell Hooks and I read Angela Davis, and I feel there's that same sense of urgency in an active, powerful voice that behavior analysis developed. And that's why I'm wondering if you see JCBS as being a curious, idiosyncratic kind of American journal that may be very different from Bratt and the other psychological journals that we might publish in. And I'm American, I'm part of the problem, and I just want to own that. Like,
we're really all part of the problem. I mean, perhaps because of my particular status of having dual citizenship, and you could add demographics that put me in a fairly comfortable position. But I look at things in more and more in systems, and like everybody is, because we are influenced by the way science is changing in society, so we understand more and more dynamic and systems. And I really feel like it's more helpful to look at the role that everybody is playing and empower people even when they are not in the dominant group. Like, for example, I look back then when I started writing, there was probably room for me to express myself more, even ask questions, say, is it an American thing? Is it a science thing? What do you think? I'd be curious. And maybe I would have learned to keep my voice inside that system more. So it's not like I was powerless and it was like, well, either you do that or you lose your job, you will never publish. Nobody said that to me either, I was saying that in response to when you said you're part of the problem. Because I wouldn't want this whole discussion, not only here but in general, to turn into I wouldn't want to see Americans apologize for their success and what they've brought, because then I feel like the dynamic is reversed, and I wouldn't want Americans to lose their way of being, or speaking, or thinking. And now let's not be direct. Let's all say it might be possible that I would. No, that's not your culture. Maybe it will evolve toward that, but forcing that, I think, is not good. I think that's really the core thing here. It's like feeling forced to speak in a certain way to meet standards, or else you don't even have a say. I think that's where things become really, really problematic. And feeling forced when it's not even completely official. But what you said about the active passive voice, that's a really good example. I think probably I would say Latin languages are probably tend to use more passive voice, not in proportion with active necessarily, but more passive than English would use, probably. But I didn't know that it's something that's developed over time, even in English. What you said was really quite interesting, because it felt to me that it had always been the case, probably because I started publishing in English about, I guess 12, 13 years ago. So that was probably the signs of that trend. And yeah, I remember those guidelines, even being the automatic correction on Word, like if you write passive voice, it will underline in green, I think, and won't correct it. And it feels a little strange. But regarding your question about the JCBS, it's like for ACBS in general, I feel like it's a big experiment. I feel like it's hard to assess. Probably it's hard to be possible, but I don't have enough data to tell. I see what you mean. It seems different for sure. What you said, the origin, it seems like it's been founded by mavericks and attract mavericks. And because of the way CBS has been built, and that's really probably one of the most successful achievements of Steve and et al. Is to build a community that allows people who think differently to contribute and to feel part of it. It's not perfect. Certainly, I've been very vocal about it, so I'm not naive. But it's a place where it's possible to say out loud something different, and you're not going to be fired, or there's lots of ways that you can be ostracized, of course. But it's in comparison to a lot of other communities that I've seen or heard of, it's a place where I feel like you can be yourself. Now, I think I'm not sure, but that in order to do that, you still have to sort of pass either the screening test or to be trained to fit in the American way of being a maverick, of being for example, on the ACT listserv, and I think you're still a moderator, Tom, that you have longer experience now in doing that. I felt in the past, I remember around 2013, 14, when I was much more involved, and sometimes in debates that could be more controversial, some would say a bit heated, that there was a mismatch between the way, and I'm going to say Americans, perhaps Australians, who would approach what a debate should be like, and it's a lot of variables that are they interact here. So it's hard to say it's because of Americans or gender, and given how things have evolved over the past 4 or 5 years, even taking in consideration just the gender dynamic, there's lots of ways that I could feel like it was not possible to express myself. Was that because I was a man, because I was white, because I was not American, or I don't know. It's all these things, I guess. But I often felt, and that's again something that I've heard, for example, South Americans, Central Americans, and more Latin Europeans, Eastern Europeans say a lot, is that it was difficult to be actually paradoxically direct in those conversations. So that's the paradox, is that while in papers you need to be more direct, in conversation it seemed like it was not okay to criticize someone's work. I'm not talking about being attacking people. No, that's not something that I think in most culture you would promote. You could be okay to some extent, but that's not what I'm talking about. Is like, okay, you could, and that perhaps it's partly idiosyncratic to JCBS, with the culture of compassion, acceptance, and values over time, perhaps has become a little too nice, for lack of a better word. That's not really the word I'm looking for, but conflict avoidant, I guess. And I think you could make the case that to some extent it's linked to the American culture too, that conflict avoidance. Why? I'm going to just an hypothesis, is that I think it's too costly to be in a conflict socially in the US in comparison to countries like France, for example, where the social contract is very stable, very grounded in the state, in the governments. Like if you get fired from your job, you're not getting fired from hospitals and from everything. You're not going to die on the streets because you don't have insurance. It's not caricatural. I think the US, it's a survival thing to be socially connected outside the laws. And so, of course, you can discuss with people, argue and all, but it's you have to be careful with that. And I wonder if that it doesn't have something to do with that it's perhaps too threatening to engage in conversations, discussions, debates that are conflictual. And by conflictual, again, I don't mean personal attacks. I mean controversial. Like, I disagree with what you wrote in that paper. I think you're wrong about this. It seems like, no, I need to be much more careful with that. And I think, yeah, I don't know. It's again, in terms of purely from a cultural perspective, I think something is lost. I've heard like I said, people from Eastern Europe, Southern America, feeling a sense of relief when they talk with people in the community who are not afraid of saying things just like very direct, not afraid of offending. So I don't know. Again, it's a personal perspective. Huh? It could be misunderstandings, but I see that there's some comments, but I don't know if.
Yeah, some pretty big comments here. So maybe I can summarize one of them here. Jennifer Payne asks that the American kind of ideology and perspective on what is like the gold standard of research is randomized controlled trials, and that's what's highly valued. Yet in her work, she's working in the community with Black clinicians, Black Americans, and she often runs into this point of view that for some people in the Black community, we feel like they feel like they have to legitimize their own cultural practices and protective factors through the eyes of a different epistemology. Yet those types of interventions aren't funded by federal government. And how do we navigate this? There's this hierarchy of what is valued in terms of research.
Yeah.
Any comment on that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I work at Bastille University, which is originally a naturopathic medicine university that was founded, I think 40, 50 years ago by naturopaths who wanted to ground, I guess, alternative medicine in science. The point was not to be outside of science, was to use science to explore other ways. So I like that because I feel like that's what, in a way, that's the definition of science to me. You explore new areas where you can apply science. Now, of course, you could arguments about how to conduct good science, but that can happen inside the department of physics in a traditional school or in psychology, for sure. When you look at debates between behaviorists and cognitivists, for example, you're like, no, that's not science. That's so I said this because what I've observed since I've joined Bastille 3-4 years ago, and it might have started earlier, is that there's an interesting trend in which it feels like this field. I am in counseling and health psychology departments with fairly traditional faculty coming from the APA approved programs and things like that. So we're not that alternative inside that department. But a lot of my students either come from traditions that are more alternative in a way of thinking and definitely open to practices that are not evidence-based and don't see the idea of being evidence-based as something as crucial as in our more traditional schools in the US. And at the same time, I've definitely seen what Jennifer describes, is that to be heard, to be recognized, to be part of that community, you need to go through that process. And more, I see a process of defining, standardizing practices inside approaches that are have traditionally wanted to be not defined in such a specific way, to be measured, quantified in the traditional way, a bit like in the spirit of Rogers, for example, saying, well, he tried to do science. That's not where he was the most successful, right? And probably for a reason. But I see a trend where it's like, I guess the way what I'm trying to say is that it seems like, unfortunately, to be heard, you need to follow the same path. And so you end up losing something. And I see it culturally, I see it in terms of the philosophically, and I don't know what's the right answer to it. I don't think it's by all following the same standards. So, for example, I personally don't think that it's by doing all RCTs or all publishing in or even in English at all. That's because then something is lost. Like when I express myself in English, something is lost from when I express myself in French. It's not just the words. It's a whole way of thinking, a whole culture that's there. Now, does that mean we should have more universities inside the US, for example, where people only from a culture would go? I'm personally not a fan of that, but that's also partly my French background, where we tend to look at issues around the race, ethnicity in a more mix. So some would say colorblind. Yes, in a way, yes, but I guess I worry about the segregation in general, compartmentalization. There's an advantage, is like people can preserve their culture, can really grow inside their culture. The inconvenience is the lack of communication, the otherness, the disconnection that can happen. And I'd like to see more of a integration of both ways. And perhaps the JCBS, to go back to what you were saying, Tom, is an attempt to do that. And perhaps it's extremely successful. Honestly, I don't have the way to assess that. Maybe we don't have enough reflection about that very process. Perhaps there is too many ideas, concepts, values that are assumed to be right. They are not questioned perhaps enough. Like just an example, the concept of race, for example, I think I would say with no hesitation that both France and the US are countries, societies that have been that are and have been committed to eliminating racism. Not saying successful or if it's genuine. Or I think as societies they are on the same page. And yet you have a country, France, that has removed the term race from the constitution. Why? Precisely because of the consideration that there's nothing such a thing as different races inside humanity. Whereas in the US, it's the exact opposite. It's like recognizing more and more and more that people are black and white, and it's very, very important. And we talk about race, and kind of hard to say one is right, one is wrong. But when, and I'm just taking France and the US because I know these two cultures very well. If you bring them together, it can become really complicated to even just talk to each other. You know, it becomes like certain words should not even be said at some point, you know? So I think we really need to be careful with not reducing the diversity of our ways of thinking. Like, you know, the term that's everywhere right now, like best practices. Hey, it's easy to, now I know that everybody has heard of it regardless of the field because it's everywhere. And I really have a problem with that mentality because what's best now may not be what's best as soon as you said it, you know, just because now you say it's the best practice, maybe it's not the best practice anymore. And it's not that we've assessed what was best at a given time that bothers me, is that the establishment of this is the best practice now. This is the active voice, not the passive voice. It's as soon as we reify things in that way, we get in trouble.
Definitely. And a commenter here, Sonia, points out this idea that North Americans, and I think Americans in particular, we have a very low tolerance for being wrong or being perceived as wrong. It's very aversive to us. And so I think that informs a lot of the emphasis on these kind of randomized control trials and different things, because like they can't be wrong, right? Like this kind of idea, it's like it's perfect.
Well, yeah, I think it's a culture that relies a lot, I think, on performance, right? I mean, you could link that to pragmatism, success, and perhaps also when you start to dominate, there's a more fear of losing that domination. And it is, yeah, for better and worse, it's a country that has thrived on performance and productivity and competition. And with that come all the challenges and the downsides. It's like you have to prove that you're right, and being wrong is an issue. But at the same time, there's there is probably more ability to change also, to change perspective, point of view, because of that pragmatism too. As long as the goal is to say, be the best, then you can change also the way you think. Now, that can also turn into something that is also lacking values and meaningful grounding too. It's like the end justifies the means, right? I see these controversies happen a lot cross-culturally, not inside the US with different cultures inside the US. I think it's dominant enough to touch probably on a lot of different cultures inside the US. But as soon as you cross the border, there's something to me that shifts completely. And you know, there is an element that I haven't said, but that's important, that can be easily forgotten, is that people who don't speak English, who work in other countries and don't speak English and try to exist in the world and have to use English, one particularity that they have is that they speak 2 languages at least. And it's not just 1 + 1, it's that it's a different person. You know, a bilingual person is different than a person who speaks only 1 language. If I take just the ACBS community, I've hard time spotting main figures among American main figures who speak more than 1 language. And that's quite interesting. I'm not saying that everybody should, although part of me thinks that that might not be a good idea, you know, like exercising and eating well and learning another language just so that you can develop that kind of flexibility of thinking. And I just find it interesting because the very model of psychological flexibility relies so much on this idea of being able to change perspective I wonder if to some extent it's not just English versus another language, but also at some point the ability of thinking with different languages that might be. I guess I wish we talked about that a little more in our community.
Yeah, I mean, just that very definition of flexibility, right, is this idea we can kind of switch between these modes. And it is very depressing when I think about how few people are bilingual here, myself included. So I have a question for you. You've noticed this clear shaping of your work, of your writing in particular, since you came to the United States.
Yeah.
And the environmental forces were kind of shaping your writing in a certain way. Now that you've recognized that, do you feel like your writing is now intentionally or deliberately changing in response to that?
I don't know. It's perhaps that's part of what's challenging from a self perspective. It's that you know, it becomes integrated in such a way that you don't know anymore, and that's fine. We're always changing anyways. But if I remember, for example, when I started working on the book that I wrote with Steve and Jen, and it was the first time I was starting to write something in English really from scratch, except for emails and maybe pieces of articles, and it was obviously was difficult. I remember the first day writing a couple of sentences and almost immediately giving up the whole project, because it was not just the fact it was difficult, it was that that self-esteem, you know, that you sense, like a feeling like it's like, I guess, someone who would need to learn to walk again or something like that. It feels it's very unpleasant, but over time I felt more and more comfortable. And even though I think I tend to still think in French when I'm just with myself, I've noticed when I write even just a few ideas or taking notes for myself, I tend to write in English. And I don't know, honestly, at this point, what is French and what is English in there. The most recent things that I wrote for academic purposes, it'd be interesting to hear the feedback from people who review or read that. I haven't heard much that would say, okay, well, I can see that you're really French here, that you're not I don't know. I'm not sure how to answer this question. I think about it quite a lot, but I think I don't have the. Maybe one thing I could say is that I tend to feel more at ease with people who are not born in the US. As soon as I talk with like someone who delivers food or someone at the gym, and they happen not to be born in the US, even it could be from anywhere in the world, and there is a sense of understanding, mutual understanding and easiness that's much higher than with people who were born in the US. And when I talk about that feeling with them, they always say the same thing too. Now, of course, it could be an expat thing, we're part of the same thing, but there's something else. I think it's part of that. It's what I was saying about the social rules. And I think in the US, they are not explicit. Again, part of that way of having that freedom, things are not as written there's obviously there are laws in the US, but the way it works is that it's more implicit, it's more learned by experience. And I think for a lot of people who are not born Americans, it feels like it's a minefield, in terms of language, the thing that you can say, not say, the timing, the jokes that you can make in certain contexts or not. It's what I think Jennifer or someone else was saying, that the fear of being wrong, the fear of offending. I sense that a lot in academia too. And I know it's mocked because it's like, oh, you're afraid of saying something wrong. But yeah, I don't think being afraid is a very good states to be creative, to be empathetic, to explore, to have fun, so yeah, sorry, it's a bit random thoughts in response to what you were saying, but I guess that's part of the response is the randomness here.
Yeah, you don't need to have all the answers, right?
Yeah.
Tom has a question, and I want to distill it down a little bit. Tom talks about like how can we in the ACBS community work together to change the research and publishing community to be more welcoming and mutually shaping as a culture, as opposed to America shapes the world. The way I would distill that would be, what would be some of the indicators? And you don't have to answer this yourself, like you don't have to have the answer, but maybe we can kind of brainstorm together. What would be some of the indicators that would tell us that things are starting to change? And maybe Tom can jump in here as well.
Also, yeah, I mean, I think when indicators would be a really good thing to kind of like dashboard measures that would tell us, but also what are the steps that we as a community need to do? Because I think our practices, if this is an important question, and I think it is, practices have to change. But which practices? And how do we create the context in which practices at a cultural level change in this way?
One thing that I think is that I think that what would be useful, thinking just for ACBS and, for example, the conference or publishing papers, trainings, would be to have more collaborations between Americans and non-Americans, but in the context in which it's not the American mentoring the foreign fellow. Because I think that's the culture that we have in ACBS mostly. Let's help people, non-Americans, get to our level. And I swear, I feel like it's always still in the mentality of Americans, no matter what. And I think when you dominate, you don't see it. But to me, there's a spirit of condescension there, and we know better, we're going to help you think. I heard that issue came up with the Women's SIG back in the days when it started with the, and it's probably still true, because I hear of these things even outside ACBS, like the what is feminism, for example. And I think Americans have a hard time accepting that you can think differently than the American way. And like it's great when I see big names of ACBS do something with someone from another country, but it'd be great if they did it more in the spirit of, I'm going to learn something from you, you know, and not just, I'm going to help you get a voice, I'm going to help you learn something, or I'm going to help you publish something so you'll be a big name. And because that's in that process that I think the person, to me, feels like it's like they get the training before to be more like us, more like an American. And I don't think it's intentional at all. I really don't think so. I've never heard anything that felt like it was something that people, like we're not a cult, you know, and really not. But I think it's there. And I think that could be implemented relatively easily. You know, like could be even like, if just think of the trainers community in the ACBS, like a conference, every other year you do a training with someone from another country, but the way it's shaped, it's like it's led by the other trainer, and it could be some, not that I would want to add too many rules there, but you see what I mean here? It's maybe, Tom, you've done things that in that spirit with your work in Sierra Leone, and you probably could speak to that kind of process. You're probably among the few in the actors community who done the work where it seems like you didn't come and say, hey, I'm going to teach you how to do things, but from a more humble perspective.
Yeah, I think to create research with other people rather than to mentor other people in my way of doing research is really, really difficult. And I wouldn't say that I'm good at it, because we ultimately have to publish in the journals that exist, not in the journals that we wish would exist. And that's why I think that we as this community need to bring this to ACBS. I mean, my experience with ACBS is that it's an organization that believes it is doing everything that it possibly can do to facilitate researchers and practitioners emerging from the developing world. The very word developing world is striking me as being really wrong.
Sure.
But that's the word that is commonly used. And the fact that that is the word that is used reflects part of the problem, and that somehow these people have to get to be more like us.
Yeah.
And as I work in doing research with people in Uganda and in Sierra Leone, I'm discovering that there are some epistemologies, like Jennifer was talking about, some epistemologies that are just very different. Yeah. And I grew up in the streets of New York City, and I kind of like know that the epistemology of my group that I grew up with, how they know that they know, is very different than American scientific tradition, and equally valid, and if not even more important because it's so unknown to everyone else. And how we generate a movement here in service of creating a global research community where everyone learns from each other, and not just those with higher degrees from America kind of dictate to everyone else how you're going to learn what you know.
Yeah. It's in what you're saying. One of the things I'm thinking of, and it's like the importance, I think, of not creating a context of shame, because then it leads to this avoidance of saying certain things or changing the term. I'm not against the idea of changing terms, because of course that can change functions, and like if we change developing to something else. But I think there's perhaps sometimes or often an over focus on that, and becomes changing the form over the function. And so because now we say something else, the issue is fixed, but in fact nothing has changed. And the worst thing is that we can't even talk about it anymore, because we've fixed the issue, and there's not even a word for it anymore. So that's conflict avoidance to me. That's putting things under the rug, and that's what shame does, right? It pushes you to hide, to not speak, and I'd rather hear people make. I don't even really want to think of it in terms of mistakes. That's what I say to my students who are younger and are in this culture of they know that they need to educate themselves to know everything about cultures and genders and everything before they can even start speaking, and say, no, don't do that, because I mean, you can do that, obviously educate yourself and everything, but be careful, because if you're thinking from that perspective of, I need to know before I can speak, you're also going to end up thinking that you know, and that's, you're not like actually going to you're going to think, okay, I took that training, or I read this book, and now I know. Well, you just perpetuated the same thing. So I think I get to be willing and create the contingencies that are going to reinforce being wrong in public, and to the point where it's not being wrong, it's just sharing perspectives. I'm pretty confident that that's where we're going, because it's unavoidable. I don't think humans, we really like that much to be disconnected from each other. So there can be phases like that when we name, when we categorize, and at some point it's like, it's just really boring to speak only to people who say exactly the same thing. I'm gonna go see what people are saying there. So I'm not that worried overall, but I guess what we're doing now is part of that process of doing something different. I think it's Nicolas Tornick a few years ago, when I might have started that discussion on the listserv, when I had pointed that I think we were on a streak of like, I don't remember how many presidents of ACBS were white male American, and if you looked at even people elected on the board and who they had been elected against, it really felt like, okay, every time it's an American, they win. Every time it's a white male, they win. Every time, like, you could look at almost everything, and it was the case. And I remember Nicolas said something. It's pretty simple, but I think it's really, really wise. Saying sometimes you just need to, and it's not the right way to say it, but it's something like the noticing is the first thing, and maybe you can even just stick with that instead of, I notice something, we need to do something. Noticing is doing something, and it can already influence the way you are responding. I think it's underestimated. There's something more, because I think it maintains a little more freedom also, people to have the time to reflect and empathize. When we go too fast, there is no empathy. It's like, oh, I said something wrong, I need to change, or oh, we don't have enough Black people on the board. We really need to find someone. I find that really, really dehumanizing when it's, but if you say, oh, wow, we never had a Black president, for example. Okay, well, let's think about that. Let's explore that. Let's take the time to really, really connect. What would that be like to be Black in ACBS, and to these kind of things, like just taking the time. I find that it's a really personal perspective here, but that then the right answers comes more naturally and feels really more right than if we go fast and say, we need to change the numbers.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I think the change has to, well, I'm of two minds. The change ideally would be organic. It would just kind of occur. But I do think policy has to be implemented to support the change, or to
agree.
Direct the change, at least.
Just not too fast, I guess.
Yeah, wonderful.
Just not too fast, so that the numbers are, like equal.
Yeah. Well, so we got about 5 more minutes, 5 good more minutes here. Any other questions from our participants or the audience? I'm curious to hear some more voices. Okay.
Sorry, I didn't read the.
Yeah,
Manabu, because I was talking or listening to what we were saying, but I see there was a lot.
Yeah, Manabu has an idea from Japan. He's saying, we must organize more workshops and publish more articles in multiple languages. So having the same event, but in multiple languages, because there are tons of ACBS members who can speak more than one, more than 2 languages. And I think that is something that we could be doing more of we could have had this event today in French, although it would have had to have somebody else asking you the questions because I don't speak French, but we could have arranged it, right? It could have happened.
I had this crazy idea that I'm sure nobody would support, but that when the conference is in a country where the local language is not English, that the conference would be in that language, and that it would be part of the adventure, I guess, the journey for people attending the conference to learn the language. Now, it's not easy to learn a language, but it's easier than we tend to think too. I think that's part of the issue too. Like, you can learn a language pretty well in 6 months if you don't have to spend 10 hours a day. I think it's once you know at least another language, you understand that it's possible. But I think for Americans who speak only one language, it's completely well, foreign to them. It's really hard to even comprehend what it's like. I know, because I've been there when I could speak only one language. The idea of speaking another language felt like almost like an out-of-body experience, because it feels very weird. It feels like it's not going to be my thoughts. And then when you can do it, you realize that it's much more natural than you would have thought. So I'm just saying, I feel like that would be perhaps it's probably not possible that way. But when I like that the translations, like it's been the case in the online, but it still feels it's practical for sure. But again, it's the words, it's not the whole thing. It's better than nothing. But my dream would be Steve Hayes learns to understand Spanish, not even speaking Spanish. They just understand Spanish enough so they can attend a workshop in Spanish, and he's there and he asks a question, and even if he asks it in English and it's translated, but like, to me, that would be not just a symbolic act. I'd be curious to see what happens from there. It's like an experiential exercise. There could be much more than we think that happens from that, something like that.
Yeah, very interesting. I think that's a good idea. So maybe we'll have the same event in French down the road at some point, because I'm sure
Yeah,
you can express yourself much differently, right? Like you were saying.
Probably, yeah. I don't know. Yeah, with French people for sure.
Excellent. So perhaps we can just kind of wrap up here. And if you have anything that you'd like to plug or to promote, or any, where can people find you?
No, nothing to promote. I think just in terms of maybe just advice based on my personal experience is that it's I encourage those who would like to be more heard or published in English, or to reach out, because one of the strength of ACBS is that it's a community that is very accessible. I think even the main figures are accessible. It may have evolved since I joined 10-15 years ago, but you can be helped. There's a lot of people who would like to help, and perhaps if you do that, having somewhere in your mind this thought that I was saying earlier, that you don't have to embrace everything that's taught to you or told to you, as it's like you also have something to contribute to, and I think you'll find in CBS people who can hear that too. That's what I meant earlier by everybody is responsible, or at least has agency there. If we just stick with Americans, they dominate, so they don't listen. That's not true, at least not ACBS. You need to speak to be heard too. No.
Wonderful. I think that's exactly correct. Sometimes we can be maybe a little bit too focused on, oh, but we're different, right? ACBS is different, right, than those other guys. I think we can go too far on that side, but I do think there is something different about ACBS, and that is the reason people join and people stay members and often become very participatory members.
Yeah, when I hear new members on the list or here and there tell me about their experience, and I realize that it's a reminder that there is something special, and really positive about it. So.
Well, my deepest appreciation for you, Dr. Villatte. Thank you very much, and hopefully we can continue this conversation at some form at another point.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. It's nice. Yeah.
You're welcome. All righty, thank you, everybody. The recording will be posted.
All right, bye-bye, everyone.